Hello, and welcome to So What's All the Fuss About Containers Anyway? My name is Brian Randall, and I'm a partner with MCW Technologies. When we think about everything that Microsoft Azure has to offer, it's a great wealth of features and functions that has services available for just about anything you could want. As you can see on the screen here, I've highlighted one specific section of the Azure platform, specifically compute. From the beginning, Microsoft has made it easy for you to take your workloads from your on-premises data centers and move them up to the cloud, particularly for things like lift and shift and for IaaS solutions. And we've been able to do that with a rich set of virtual machine technology. One of the great changes that has come to virtualization over the years has been the ability to use what are known as containers. This is something that got started in the Linux community and was brought to the forefront with Docker. Microsoft has worked in a strong partnership with the folks at Docker to bring containers to Windows. What we're going to look at is how you can use Windows containers today in preview on top of Microsoft Azure. So you might be asking yourself, what are containers? Containers are basically the natural evolution of virtualization from what we have today with virtual machines, in that we get benefits of isolation, reuse, and scalability. But we do so through greater reuse and better usage of resources. One of the downsides of virtual machines is that when you create a virtual machine, it is in fact a self-contained copy of a machine. It has its own operating system, file system, storage requirements, and ultimately hardware requirements to run. And oftentimes, what you're looking for to get out of virtualization and virtual machines is isolation and mobility. And that's something that containers do with a lot less overhead and with a lot greater ease of use. When we think about the container ecosystem, we have what are known as container runtimes. As I mentioned, in the Linux world, Docker pioneered this implementation. Through the partnership with Docker and their own innovation, Microsoft is bringing containers to the Windows Server platform in Windows Server 2016, and of course, to Microsoft Azure. A container image is built on top of a container OS. That OS can then be added to building things like application frameworks. Say, for example, you wanted to have a web server. You could add IIS and ASP.NET. On top of that, you could then add your application services. And that unit of work, a container, is now something that's portable and can be persisted and shared within an image repository. Once it's in the image repository, it is an immutable copy that can then be pulled out and used in different runtime environments: development, test, and yes, production. We get all the benefits that we've had with virtual machines in this type of duplication and mobility, but without a lot of the overhead. Containers are much smaller by their very nature. When we think about working with containers, it's important to think about how we work with computers today. We typically have a physical host. And on top of that physical host, we have an operating system, like Windows Server. And then we install our applications and our frameworks inside that operating system. Taking it one step further, we have an operating system that then can support hardware-assisted virtualization, like that which is available inside Azure, as well as on-premises with Hyper-V. When using hardware virtualization, you're able to simulate another machine on top of the existing hardware, a virtual machine. A virtual machine that has virtual hard disks, virtual CPUs, virtual network cards. That virtual machine supports having its own separate copy of the operating system installed, to the point that the operating system inside the virtual machine, completely different type of operating system. For example, I could be running Windows Server 2016 on the physical host, yet running Linux inside my virtual machine. Once I have this operating system, I can, of course, install my application frameworks and my applications. And I can do this repeatedly to have greater usage of my physical hardware. Now, when we take these virtual machines and images to their next logical conclusion, is the fact that having an entire separate virtual machine and operating system might be overkill for certain applications, to the point that you're not getting enough benefit from the overhead that it takes to create and manage the virtual machine. What we want is the ability to duplicate, the ability to share, the ability to scale out as needed, but use resources more effectively. So how would this look with containers? Well, once again, we're going to start with a computer and an operating system. However, now we're going to have this notion of a container. When we think about it in Windows, this is a new kernel mode implementation that allows the container to have access to system resources and operating system resources, but to have them isolated from other containers and the host operating system. So we're getting a lot of the features of hardware-assisted virtualization of virtual machines, but without the extra overhead of running an entire copy of the operating system and some of the extra overhead that goes with that. I can then have multiple containers running simultaneously, isolated from the host and isolated from each other. Now, taking it one step further, what if I have hardware-assisted virtualization on the computer and I install a virtual machine? One of the great things we have with Windows containers in Windows Server 2016 is, yes, I have the ability to run an operating system on a virtual machine that also in turn runs containers. So what I want to show you is how easy it is to get started with containers in Windows Server 2016 Preview 3 that is available today on top of Microsoft Azure. So over here, I'm in a web browser and I'm connected to the Microsoft Azure portal. And I've created a Windows Server 2016 virtual machine with container support already. And I'll be using that for my demos. But I want to show you how easy it is for you to get started yourself. Simply access the portal and click the New button. And when the wizard comes up, you want to pick Compute, Virtual Machine, and then From Gallery. Once you're in the gallery, you want to come over here and pick under Microsoft Windows Server the Container Preview image. Windows Server Container Preview. We'll click Next. And from here, it's just a matter of defining a virtual machine like you normally would. You need to give it a name, specify the size you need, specify your administrator user, name and password, and then you go through and finish up the wizard and create it. Once it's allocated and started, you'll be able to connect to it with Remote Desktop. And you can use the Connect button inside the portal, and that'll take you into the virtual machine, and it'll start you at a command prompt. Now understand that everything I'm showing you today is preview. This is not for production, and it is subject to change and subject to evolving for production-ready workloads in the future. Now, at this command prompt, I can't really do anything unless I have some type of container management software. Through the partnership with Docker, Microsoft has brought Docker to Windows Server 2016. And in the long run, you will be able to move images that are Docker compatible between Docker compatible hosts on Windows and Docker compatible hosts on Linux. But what I'm going to show you today is how I can use PowerShell to work with Windows containers today on Windows Server 2016 Preview 3. First thing I need to do is start up PowerShell. Now, once I'm inside PowerShell, I can look up the various commands that are available for working with containers. To do that, I'll do the Git command, and I'll specify that I'd like to look at modules related to containers. As you can see, there's a number of commands specifically dedicated in PowerShell to working with containers. When you go to work with containers, the first thing you need to do is start with some type of container base that has an operating system. This virtual machine image that Microsoft has published up into Microsoft Azure has that available to us right now. So what I can do is use the PowerShell command git container image, and this will give me a list of all the installed containers on this machine. This one right here, Windows Server Core, is the built-in one, and you can see this was published by Microsoft. The second one on the list is one that I created myself earlier as part of this demo. Once you have a base image, you can create new containers from it, and then add your own files to it, and then create new images from that one. Now, to do that, I want to make sure that what I create might be accessible to the internet if necessary, if I decide I want to host some type of services. In order to do that, I need to have a way to map the host networking stack onto the container. The image that was provided by Microsoft already has a virtual switch available. And if I use the PowerShell command get VM switch, I can see what its name is. This is something I will need to create my own container. So at this point, I can also check to see if there are any containers already created. And I can do that with the get container command. As you can see, I have one called MSFT Web SVR that's currently not running. So before I create any of my own, let's just start with this one and see what I can do with it. So I'm going to create a variable here called web server. And I'm going to grab that using the get container command. Once I have that variable, I can use the start container command to start it up. Now, this container has IIS installed and a couple web pages. So if I go outside to my host here and access it from the internet, we can see if it works. So what we'll do here is come over and grab the public virtual IP for my virtual machine. And it says, hello Windows containers. This is going to be good. Now I'm going to stop that container. And to prove a point, if we do an ls on the host, we'll see there's no IIS running on the host machine. If we go back out and refresh that page, it's going to time out because there's not going to be anyone listening to handle that request. So how did I create this container? Well, as I mentioned, I started with a container image. We see I have this Windows Server core. So what I'm going to do is create another variable. We'll call this new CONT for container equals new container. And we'll give it a name called live demo. Now, I need to tell it what is the foundation, what is the base image. And one way to think about this is very much like taking a sys-prepped virtual machine image and creating a new virtual machine. I'm using a container image as my base. So I'll use the container image switch. And we'll specify the name, Windows Server Core. And finally, if I want to be available on the network, I'm going to use the switch name parameter and specify virtual switch. This is going to take that base image, and I mistyped virtual, so we'll fix that. This is going to create the new container based upon the Windows Server Core image. So now, if I look at my containers, we see the new one called live demo. And just like with the previous container that I showed you, I'm going to start this up. Okay, at this point, the container is running, but it's just a simple empty Windows container. There's no web server, nothing else in it. If I want to get in and work with files or manipulate the container, I can do that by using the enter ps session command. So we'll do enter ps session, and we'll specify the container ID. And the container ID is a property off of this container reference. And then I'm going to tell it I want to be able to do things as administrator. Now, what you see there is that I have this new ID in front of my PowerShell command. This is telling me that I'm actually inside this particular container. Now if I do a listing, you can see there's files in here in System32. And if I do a listing here, you'll notice that there's no inet pub. There's only program files perf logs. There aren't those extra files that we saw on my host. So this is an isolated file system that all write operations are caught at the kernel level and persisted into the container file. Now, at this point, it's just another copy of Windows. So one of the things I could do is I can install a web server. So for example, I could use the add Windows feature command and do something like web server. Now, as I mentioned, this current preview is not for production use. And there are some bugs out there that you might run into. One of them is when you're working with the add feature command, the first time you run it, it might fail. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do this first command. And I'm going to tell it to silently continue. And this will run for a couple seconds. And then it will most likely fail, because that's what it tends to do in this preview release. Okay, as expected, it did fail. So we'll come up here, and this time we'll run it. And it'll jump back up and finish the installation. Now, once this is done, the web server will be available, but because I'm up in Microsoft Azure, it won't be directly accessible. On my Microsoft Azure virtual machine, I enabled port 80. The next thing you have to do, though, once you want to expose a container, is you have to map the host port to the container. Now, I'll show you the command that I've already issued inside my virtual machine, and you'll see it's right here. Add static mapping, the NAT name, container, IP address, etc. This is all documented well up on the containers website up on Microsoft.com. But the point to be aware is if you're looking at what I'm doing, you're going to have to do the same thing, which is expose the web server to the internet for it to work if you try this up inside Azure. So as you can see, my web server is installed. And now I have an inet pub folder and a www.root folder. Now, as I mentioned, I've already exposed this to the internet using that command. So if we go out here to my host and hit my host IP address again, we see the IIS start page come up. So what I want to do is let's pull down a file that I've saved up on GitHub, and we'll pull this into the virtual machine into this folder. Now if we go back out and refresh the page, there's that one, and we'll do one more. That's page 2. And now we can go back over here. And there's page 2. So I now have a container that has IIS and 2 of my own custom application pages installed on it. So I can exit out of this PowerShell session. And we can see that my live demo is running, so we're going to stop this. And I got my variable wrong, so let's go grab my variable from my history, new container. And now that I got this container shut down, and I've got it configured the way I want to, I can create a new container image that I can then share with my development team partners, testers, or even put into production. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to come over here and save this off. And we're going to use the new container image command. I'm going to Put a hyphen there. And we're going to give it a name. Call this my web server. And we'll use the container switch. And we're going to specify new cont. And then we're going to specify the publisher is Brian. And we need to give it a name. Oops, I got the name right there, my web server. Container. And finally, we need a version. All right, so I'm going to do a container, call it my web server, provide this container as input to the image, publisher is me, and the version is 1.0. Okay, let's take a look at my container images. Now we can see my new image, and taking it to its logical conclusion, I can now create a new container based upon my existing one that has those two files in it. So let's go for and do that. So final equals new container, name is my web server. Oh, sorry, that's a container image. So this is my demo web server. Container image. My web server. And the switch name is virtual switch. All right. Now we'll start the container. And we'll use enter PS session. And what we're going to do is once we get inside the session, change over. There's inet pub. There's root. There's my pages. And because this container is using the same address, I can refresh the page. That shows up. And there's that page, and it's still running. Exit out. Stop the container. And once it's shut down, decided didn't want to shut down. All right, it's stopped. There's my containers. And I can even get rid of the container with that command. So that was just a quick demo to show you how easy it is to get started with containers. Just a few PowerShell commands, and you can have completely isolated environments running your application and your application frameworks of choice. You can share and reuse them during development. They're a great tool for doing things like unit testing. You can then share them on with your test teams for testable environments. And finally, share all the way to IT into production so that you have a complete release pipeline based upon containers. You can learn more today by going to aka.ms/Windows Containers. And thank you very much.